navigating the regulatory maze for startup success.
Welcome everyone to our regulatory panel. So I think we should start with introductions. So I'm Karandeep Singh Badwa and I'm founder of QRA Medical, which is a quality and regulatory firm. So chaps, feel free to go ahead.
Good afternoon everyone. I'm Kenneth Shaw, Director at Medical Devices.
Good afternoon everyone. I'm James Romeo. I'm the founder of Romeo Life Sciences Consulting, a consulting firm that provides many services for healthcare business around Europe.
Good afternoon, everybody. Marco Goulart here. I'm investment associate for HTH, that stands for F Technology Holding. We are an Italian venture capital backed by one family, that is the Zambon family, owner of the Zambon Group. So we are the private investment vehicle of the Zambon family.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Frank Enright. I'm from Incremed and Companion QMS. I provide quality and regulatory solutions for the MedTech sector and also support that with Companion QMS, which is a software solution for quality management systems. I don't want to leave the moment go by to say that I'm really thrilled to be here for a lot of reasons. I have a great panel with me. We're good friends from the last couple of days. But also that my great-grandaunt was in this very room here between 1915 and 1919 as a nurse. So it's great to be back again as an Enright and in this absolutely prestigious room again.
So I think the title is very fitting, regulatory maze. So Frank, the question to you, when it comes to regulatory strategy, how important is that and what should be in that strategy as part of it?
Yeah, it's so vital, and I mean we know it even from an investment point of view that it's so important to begin with the end in mind, and this very much applies to MedTech and MedTech devices that we're innovating and designing, because obviously we need to know where we're going. So this topic that says regulatory maze, I mean, how do you find your way around the maze? You need a map, you need a strategy and a pathway to get there, and you need somebody who knows that pathway. So people on this panel here and many others in the audience, they know the way. So it's really important as an innovator, when you know your technology, you know your device, get speaking to people who know how to get you there, how to get you to the end point, to decide if you're going for CE marking, US FDA approval, and what will be the steps to get there. Because we can establish that for you, we can define that pathway for you, we can pick out those points where you may need a significant investment, or you can hold off at various points depending on what the pathway is for you. So really important to get that regulatory strategy in place. And can I say, one of the questions that's come up from a lot of people over the last couple of days is, which should go first, US or EU? And we discussed that yesterday as well. It's very important in each instance to assess that, because I always can see in so many projects that sometimes, of course, we're pitching for US because of maybe reimbursement, potentially because it looks like an easier strategy. But I'm regularly still seeing instances where you're held up for some reason. FDA require more clinical data conceivably than Europe, or there's some biocompatibility issue that's going to take you several months to resolve, possibly a change in design even for materials, etc. So keep both running in parallel. It doesn't cost anything to do a regulatory strategy at the beginning that looks at both, looks at the feasibility of both, and then you can always change track along the way with a lot of things done in common in design control, risk management, etc.
Very valid points, and I feel as though, my opinion on this, when it comes to EU or US or UK, go for where your product is going to be the most impactful, where it's going to change the most lives, or where it's actually needed. That should be your strategy first, and then the money will follow, rather than see where's the best reimbursement. That's my view. And an interesting point that you made, Frank, of course, is investment. So Marco, I want to hear from your point of view as an investor. What do you look for when it comes to regulatory, and what's your understanding of regulatory strategy?
Thanks so much for the question, which is not an easy question to answer. But by the way, I think that the US market for us is really mandatory, and I will focus the answer on two main topics. First of all, the US market for sure is mandatory because, I mean, it's a unitary market. You have just, one health system with insurances and so on. While in the Europe, we have it is a fragmented market. I mean, also who are considered go-to-the-market strategies or regulatory pathways. So for us, having a clear vision of the cost about the regulatory pathway in the US and the Europe is really mandatory. But most of all, I think that the landscape has changed, I mean, within the last 5 years, in which before, I mean, the US market was a tough market in order to get into, also in terms of regulatory landscape, while right now with the new MDR in Europe is really fragmented. So you have different notified body, we have a lot of delay for what concern notified bodies. So right now for us, the US market is the first market to go for. But when I do talk with a startup, I want them to have a clear vision of, if it is a 510K, a PMA, or de novo, and also what costs around the regulatory pathway. Because for me, costs are half or the majority of my investment. And yeah, I mean, another things about Europe is really the delay of the notified body. And right now, entering and scaling up in the European market is not that, I mean, it's not like it was 5 years ago.
So James, what's your opinion on that view, as someone who lives in Europe?
Thank you. So about this, I would say, especially in terms of startups, I would say the startups in general, they face many challenges, especially AI-based startups regarding, for example, data privacy or algorithm accountability or other ethical considerations. And startups in general, and the ones that are focusing on AI, especially, they face difficulties also regarding the new regulatory path that the European Union isn't going to establish. For example, the AI Act, recently established in Europe, that it's more oriented for the patient, for the last consumer, so it's protect the data privacy of the consumer somehow, and try to minimize the data that might be collected from an AI app. For example, a lot of attention is going to on the model that there is behind the startup, AI-based startup. And so during this last period, the European Union is doing a lot, especially with this last act, about to protect the patient and the consumers, privacy, identity, just collecting data, just train the AI startup, the AI model, just with data that are useful for a specific purpose. So if you would like to make a comparison between the European Union and the US, I would say that EU is more focused on data protection and privacy protection, and sometimes this lowers and slow down the deployment of a new technology, for example. US is more focused on a new innovation product, so a new technology that is coming out, but maybe they lose something regarding the data privacy or the data protection, especially regarding AI-based startups. I mean.
Yeah, so I agree with you on that one. It's a bit like people just think of regulations as medical devices or like FDA, etc. But you have cybersecurity, you have data protection. That's also part of regulation. It all comes down to laws. So Kenneth, I'm going to ask you the question here. When it comes to resourcing, of course, if you want to follow cybersecurity, you want to follow regulatory, you need resources in a company, and it's very important that startups prioritize that resource. So what's been your experience of that?
Okay, well, I think we all know that the the biggest problem with startups is the money, as Marco will probably tell us. So when you're looking at, you have a small team, limited investment, it's like, how do you budget for regulatory? Now, obviously, looking at regulatory, it's something which, it looks at face value, it's not going to give you any value to your product. But in actual fact, it's such an incredibly important aspect which needs to be taken into account at an early stage. And Frank mentioned the regulatory strategy. That should be done at the early stage. And so at that point, you might say, okay, so do we have anyone internal? Or should we hire someone? Or should we contract an independent consultant on this? So it all depends on the finances available. So obviously, if you go for someone who's a consultant who's done this a lot, it's a high initial cost, but it is something which gets you to the end point in terms of regulatory a bit quicker than if you had to get someone, train them, they might not be too experienced. Plus, if you do have someone that you're hiring as a regulatory person internally, that's obviously a bigger cost over a period of time. So that really needs, so there's this really, you know, there's like a battle between, okay, regulatory and every other section of the product development team. Another thing which I'd like to mention is also the timing. So it is crucial to take into account, let's say, regulatory requirements in the design stage or, you know, before the design stage. Because from my experience, what happens is that as a startup, they take into account these things towards the end when they're ready for CE approval, for example, and they realize, oh, we didn't take this into account, you know. So that goes back to the drawing board. You have more expenses. You're gonna annoy your investor, you know, with something like that. So yeah, it's all regulatory needs to be taken into account at an early stage.
So come back to Frank here. I feel as though I live by the statement, a quality system is built, not bought. And as someone who works in quality management systems and specializes in that, what's your view and opinion when I say that statement?
Yeah. Well, maybe we've sometimes to be careful when we consult that we don't overwhelm and again make it feel like too much of a maze for a startup company. So there are a lot of aspects of a QMS that are relatively common. I won't pretend it's otherwise, but obviously every QMS then has to be tuned to be right for the device that you're developing. So, you know, you could have a relatively low class of device, class 1 device, which doesn't need all of those bells and whistles that a class 3 device requires. So you do then, that's when you need to be smart about what you're implementing, the risks that you're managing and making sure that the project you're managing and the QMS that's installed for that is appropriate so that you're getting a safe device to market and you're looking after your money properly as well along the way, that we're not wasting money by putting in something that's too lean and is obviously going to cause problems maybe for the device design along the way.
So an open question here for any of you guys who want to answer it. How do you explain quality and regulatory and the importance to people? Because people see it as a burden, but they don't realize that it's designed to save lives. You know, the whole point of medical devices, we want to impact the world, we want to make the world a better place, we want to save lives, help people that live with certain conditions. But how do you explain the importance?
If I can just answer that really quickly. So if you are talking to a startup, it's usually, okay, they do want to save lives, but they also want to bring it to market. So I sort of approach it as I explain, look, this is the background, right? We are saving lives. We are improving the quality of the devices. Yes, it is extra burden on the company to look at the regulation, but at the end of the day, at least in the EU, definitely, we're improving the quality of the products. So apart from explaining that, I also say, you know, the quicker that you can get the regulation sorted out, the quicker you're on the market, you're generating revenue and so on. So I show them what the background is, but I tell them why it's important to them, really.
James, Frank, Kenneth, what's your opinion on that?
I really agree with Kenneth. So regulatory and also the go-to-market has to move in parallel. So the regulatory is very important, and also in the strategy of the startup, for example, that needs to take care since the day zero, all the regulatory compliance that they have to follow. And of course, if they don't have the proper know-how, then maybe you can take advantage of a consulting firm, for example, or guidance from someone that's more expert on that field. And for sure, regulatory, it's mandatory and has to move parallel since the day zero of the startup.
I think you go straight to the point for the fact that, yeah, for sure, regulatory and quality, I mean, is for safety, but at the same time for investor, yes, a ticket for investor, I mean, is the way you open up the conversation with investor and also you base your valuation. I mean, if you are class 3 medical devices, I mean, compared to a class 1, for sure, there is a difference in terms of valuation, but not just because of the market. Maybe the class 1 has a greater market, the class 3 has a lower market or, smaller one. But at the same time, the pricing is really different one between a class 1 or a class 3. Even for what concerns, a de novo or a 510K. I mean, sometimes when you go for a 510K, you don't have, a predicate to use. So this means that you have to create from scratch a new market. And this is what maybe sometimes investors are looking for. In my case, I don't want to see a Me Too device on the market because maybe we have too much device in that case and there is no innovation. So, I mean, this really drives also my money. I mean, when I do invest, I want something that is really striking. I mean, most of the investors also at this conference, they are looking for something that is really innovative. I think that we're also attending a plateau in terms of innovation. I mean, a suggestion, an advice for startup is go and look around what is out there, because sometimes, most of them say, look, we have the best, we are first in class, or we are the only one devices, and you're like, no way, that's not true. So please be aware of the market, and because this is really a way to talk with investors. At the same time, regulatory pathway is really important to understand that claims shape your devices and shape your market, and also the way you interact with the health insurances or with the health system.
Frank, your opinion on this?
Yeah, well, I'd like to give a more general opinion about, I'm just aware that there are some people listening and it's about the regulatory maze, and I suppose just based on a couple of conversations earlier today, even with startup companies, something that's really important to realize is that maybe a startup is feeling very overwhelmed by how much they have to do from a regulatory point of view and from a setup of a quality management system. And one of the things I encourage, and I'm sure the other guys in the panel do as well, is do things incrementally. So at the beginning, a regulatory startup just needs to do things like change control, design control, risk management, being really sure of your supply chain and the traceability of those products. And you don't need management review, internal audits, et cetera, at an early point when you're such a busy designer with maybe not enough money on board and not enough resources on board. So I just think in terms of that regulatory pathway again, do things incrementally, do things when you have the money, put in the controls that you must have, put those in on time, but just step out the plan that puts in the other controls when it's appropriate to do so that you're not draining your resources and time unnecessarily.
Following on from that, I feel as though, and I'm going to bluntly say this, a lot of people do not even know what their medical device is. And what I mean by that is, what's your intended use statement? What's your intended population? What's your contradictions? Where issues do you want to resolve? What's your patient population? Which part of the world? And if you don't have that piece ready, you can't do your clinical data properly, you can't do your regulatory properly. So what's been your guys' experience when it comes down to trying to explain to a client that you really need to nail down what your device actually is?
I feel like we're going like this all the time. But yeah, I 100% agree with that. I mean, usually when a client comes up to us, it's like they don't have that intended purpose done, and they don't understand how powerful that is. And the intended purpose is not just like, okay, we're going to do this, but like you mentioned, we need to nail down our indications, contraindications, and it's just showing them how important that is, even when you come to your assessment by your notified body. So they're going to be checking out, let's say, your indications. Do you have enough clinical data to back up those indications and claims? So yeah, it is a pretty important bit. And like you said, if you don't have that, you really cannot go anywhere in terms of regulation.
And I think an interesting piece is also the clinical part, which we should address. It's clinical is also all about a big part of regulatory. How do you determine the sample size? How do you determine the demographic? How do you answer those questions, particularly for the founders here of a medical device? Because clinical trials are very expensive. How do you determine, is this efficient enough? And especially if you want to go to multiple jurisdictions, you have to make sure the population size and the demographic that you choose is representative of the whole world. So what's been your guys' experience of that?
If I can jump on this, I think that KOL interview and KOL, I mean, are really important. I mean, you have to bring in your board KOL because they really drive, I mean, your company. They have really important, insightful, I mean, on this topic because, you know, it is not easy to understand how many patients do you really need. I mean, every startup needs different patients, but if you present data, I mean, on 10 patients, maybe they are good, but then if you scale up to 100 patients, it's completely another world. So in terms of, you know, understanding patient, how many patients you need, I think it is more a matter of, for sure, US, maybe they require more patients than the Europe. Please consider gender. Most of the time, women they are not really, I mean, included in clinical trial. Why they should be central in clinical trial. And at the same time, I think that you need to leverage KOL and company like the people on this panel. I mean, consultant companies and people that do know what do you need, and also they understand your technology.
Yes, if I may.
Frank, sorry, go ahead, James.
If I may, just a small intervention. I would say company, like consulting company can help, as you, Marco, said before. And of course, just a good idea is sometimes it's not enough. For a startup, for example, maybe they have a good idea, but it's important to understand the market. What are your margins in that specific market? Each market, especially in Europe, it's very fragmented. You have to understand each single country, and even within the single country, there's some variability. So a consulting company can help for sure a startup to better understand what is the real market and what are their future goals for that specific idea.
Frank?
Yeah, I just want to add to a point that came up just a couple of minutes ago regarding intended use and indications for use, because again, a live example over the last couple of days for me was that a company has had to pivot after investing quite a bit of time on what their device was going to be, because they suddenly discovered when they looked for a 510K approval pathway that they had invented their own intended use indications for use, and it didn't at all match what they were hoping to match. So they missed the most fundamental thing at the beginning. So start, when you're looking for an intended use and an indications for use, start by finding one that actually exists already if you're thinking about a 510K pathway. Don't arrive at the end with a lot of work put in and maybe, you know, fantastic drawings about your design, and it's actually not going to fit a 510K pathway at the end of all that. So it's just a really simple one at the beginning. Get it in at the beginning, define it, but by all means look at what exists already. And if you're okay with having a novel design that goes down a de novo route or a class 3 route, that's fine, but make sure you look at the beginning and find one that's suited.
So I think to summarize, the key point here is to make sure you think of regulatory at the start. You don't want to pour millions or thousands into marketing and then realize your device doesn't match what the regulations say. And people see regulatory as a burden. I don't believe that. Regulatory is there to save lives, make sure that we make correct device. Again, we're playing with people's lives here. So again, if you have regulatory at the start and you have a good strategy like we discussed, you can have a very innovative device. It may take long, but it's there for a reason. So I think like we discussed yesterday, let's open it to the audience. Any questions? We're happy to answer them. Go ahead, Raf. Yeah, timelines is an interesting one, I suppose. It's a bit like, it depends on your notified body that you use if you want to go for CE marking. It depends on the availability and the expertise within there as well. So if you pick a EU notified body, it depends on the level of expertise that they have. So if you have something innovative like a software medical device, there's maybe not many experts that can work on that. But realistically, guys, would you agree with me? Minimum of 12 months. You know, that's full hands on deck. Minimum 12 months, realistically a year and a half.
For sure, I'd agree with that. I mean, they originally tell you, oh, we'll begin looking at this application at 6 months, but that's when they schedule it for 12 months, you know, yeah. So it's, yeah, definitely agree.
And I think it's better to spend 6 months more talking with, you know, FDA pre-submission and FDA meeting than, I mean, spend thousands or millions of cash and throw it. So yeah, I mean, timeline is good, but also it is in function of you know, money.
So I think the key takeaway, again, it's like really put time into regulatory. If you get your regulatory right, it's going to really put you in a position where you've got the right product, you've followed all the timeline, because the last thing that you want is your device goes out on the market and you have recalls or it's harming people, which is like completely contradictory to what medical device is about. So it's very important, of course. So we're on the last minute right now, so I'm going to pass the hand thing here. What one piece of advice would you be leaving the audience with?
Oh, perfect, because I was going to mention that one thing that you really need to do is just keep up with the regulation. Loads of guidance, loads of new regulations which might affect you. You mentioned the EU AI Act, that's going to affect you, so just keep up to date. Yeah.
Yes, I totally agree. So think since the beginning to your strategy regarding, yes, your product, but also your regulatory path. Especially if you are in Europe, regulation is strict. It's getting stricter, but this is for patient safety, for the consumer safety, but also for privacy safety, because it's getting harder also from this sense. For example, the GDPR now it's implemented, and many startups also have to consider this in their strategy, in their early strategy. So think it earlier, at the earliest stages as possible. Not only the great idea that you have at the beginning, but also think of your regulatory path that needs that to be done to get your idea on the market.
Okay.
Be realistic, be pragmatic, be honest, be clear on your pathway. I mean, you have an incredible idea, an incredible device, but it takes time to go to the market. So do not rush, and ask to the investors, ask to people, really, because investor, the one that comes from the science-based, VC, they know how to do that. And talk with the right investor. Don't put investors that are just, financial one in your cap table, because they do not really help you. You need science-backed investor.
Frank?
Yeah, just a final comment. Keep talking to people. I mean, I'm sure all of you have found over your couple of days here this week that's where you get knowledge from. So don't be afraid to ask somebody when you don't know, because I've yet to meet an innovator who knows everything, and I've yet to meet a regulatory person who knows everything either. So just keep asking people, because that's how our sector works. Is we all talk, we all share, and I think that's how you get there eventually.
Yeah, so to summarize, I think there's a lot of regulatory knowledge online, so never be afraid of regulatory. If you work within the guidelines, you'll be surprised of how much innovation you can have. But regulatory should be not the last thought, it should be the first thought. I think that's the key takeaway of what we discussed today. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you. Thank you all.